Welcome all. I'm Liz Whitehead with the U.S. News Live Events team. Today's webinar will examine building a foundation for student well-being and success at colleges and universities. You can find more details about today's speakers, as well as past and future webinars from the U.S. News Live team at usnews.com/events. You can also learn more about finding the right college fit, paying for it, and beyond at usnews.com/education. A quick note, we are recording video of today's session, and we will be making that available after the session concludes. We are also live streaming from the US News Facebook page. If you have questions, we ask that you please type them into the Q&A feature in Zoom on your screen. Later in the discussion, our moderator will try to give voice to some of those. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our terrific panel. With us today are Dr. Shante Elbert, Associate Vice President of Health and Wellbeing at Ohio State University. Rob Giulo, Senior Vice President of Impact at Vector Solutions. Terry Martinez, Vice President and Dean of Students at Hamilton College in New York. And Dr. Timothy Rennick, the founding Executive Director of the National Institute for Student Success at Georgia State University. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us. Now, I will turn it over to my colleague and our moderator, Michael Morella, Managing Editor of Events at US News. Michael?
Thank you so much, Liz, and thanks to our panelists and our audience for being with us today. We have a lot of ground we want to cover, and I'd love to dive into topics like student mental health, diversity and inclusion, and this broad definition of student success and how your campuses and the campuses you work with are measuring and working to improve that. Tim, I'd love to start with you and explore, some of the student success-oriented efforts that you've been involved with at Georgia State for a number of years. You've seen some impressive improvements in terms of graduation rates and addressing diversity gaps on campus. Can you talk to us about your work and your role as the founding director of the National Institute for Student Success?
Sure. Thank you, Michael, and thanks for having me today. I think what we've learned over the last decade at Georgia State is that we in higher ed institutions are our own worst enemies, that we set up a lot of bureaucratic processes through admissions, financial aid, registration, advising, career services, communication platforms. And what we've been able to do at Georgia State is take a data-based approach to these functions and recognize what a really debilitating impact these systems have on students' progress. Not only that, what we've been able to trace again and again and verify is that most of these administrative functions disproportionately impact students from so-called underserved backgrounds. So it's not only that our own campuses are the source of students dropping out, our own campuses are a major contributor to equity gaps. The positive news here is that we can understand the ways that we are complicit in the failure of our students to progress and graduate, and we can now scale up alternate approaches. And that's just what Georgia State has done and what this new National Institute is helping other campuses do. Taking approaches like AI-enhanced chatbots to communicate with students, to help them get through difficult bureaucratic processes. We've run random control trials with independent evaluators and seen students complete tasks like the FAFSA or removing holds from their accounts or coming to see advisors at rates 20, 30, 40% higher by having that electronic tool in their hands to give them advice 24/7, by tracking students every day for predictive analytics and recognizing problems when they first emerge rather than 3 months, 6 months, 12 months later. These sorts of approaches have been transformative. At Georgia State, what's interesting is we've raised our graduation rate about 25 points over the last 15 years, but almost 40 points, 37 points for our Hispanic students, 34 points for our Black students. So these kind of systematic supports not only are transformative for all demographic groups, they're disproportionately beneficial to students from underserved background. And as a result, Georgia State's had 6 years in a row now where our Black, our Pell, and our Hispanic or Latinx students have all graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. That's the way it should be across higher education. That shouldn't be the exception. And what we're dedicated to trying to do is make it the norm rather than the exception.
Great, thank you. Shante, I'd love to turn to you. You're also a leader at a major public university. and your role focuses more specifically on health and well-being. Can you help us understand your work and Ohio State's approach to student wellness?
Well, I can't take all the credit because I just started this brand new position in January. And so I came in with a very interdisciplinary student-centered team that really encompasses a continuum of care that has prevention, treatment, support, and some of those support entities such as our disability services and student advocacy, while not in my specific portfolio, are still part of student life. We offer student recovery and, more importantly, referrals. And I want to emphasize that because students can't get everything from us within institutions of higher education. And so these dynamic team of professionals and our students have provided these extraordinary services and use data to inform our practice. And outside of data, been able to do things that are very innovative, thanks to our Center for the Study of Student Life, and been okay being innovative, such as our wellness app, thanks to that team of data statisticians and the Student Wellness Center staff who met and built a wellness app geared based off student feedback. Not necessarily what we thought we wanted, but exactly what the students needed. But more importantly, by bringing me in as the new AVP for Health and Wellbeing, I get to bring together this unit of 4 departments to do some really great interdisciplinary work, and also build supports to our regional campuses here as extensions of the work we do here in Columbus. But also I have an arm that focuses on student life, employee well-being, which is a little bit different from some of the other AVPs of health and wellness across the country. And that is going to really be the central focus of how we work to streamline, because healthy people can also help the students. You can't have unhealthy people trying to do this work. And so that makes us a little bit different, because we want to make sure the employees here within student life are able to get the assistance and the support to be able to provide dynamic services to students. And because of that, we'll be able to do that internally, but also be front facing to students and be student centered in the same aspect and use data to inform our practice. And so I can't take all the credit. They were doing great work before I got here, but what we'll focus on is how to bring this team together, use all the dynamic programs and services to have a multimodal approach to what we are already doing, but be very intentional on streamlining how we do that, knowing that our regional campuses won't have the same supports because our regional campuses don't have all the services. And so we'll have to do things a little bit differently, and how we create those supports for those students will also be based off their needs and won't be a cookie cutter approach, which is using my prevention and public health background on how we want to serve those students and how we support the staff at those campuses. So that's just a little bit about what we'll be focusing on. Still early on, and we still have a chief health and wellness officer here on our campus, where our other campuses don't have that. So we have 2 different ways to approach that work here at Ohio State, while other campuses are still trying to get on board and trying to figure out how they want to figure out their approach to health and well-being overall.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to a few of the things that both of you said and shared. Rob, tell us about Vector Solutions, particularly those who may not be familiar with your work. What does your role entail, and how do you work with colleges and campuses all across the country to make an impact?
Sure. So Vector Solutions is an e-learning company, and our goal is to make our customers and communities safer, smarter, and better through technology-based training, through data insights, and strategic tools. So in higher ed alone, our campus prevention network consists of 2,200 colleges, universities, and national fraternity and sorority organizations. So collectively, we're reaching 9 million students, staff, and faculty every year through our prevention courses on topics like sexual assault and harassment, substance misuse, mental health, inclusion and belonging. And at Vector, my team, which is called Impact, consists of subject matter experts in those content areas, as well as social science researchers who every day are bridging research and practice through our course content, our data, our resources, and our tools, and our engagement with such a large network of partners. And some of the most exciting work that we're doing is around the development of frameworks and standards that really look comprehensively at institutional strategies and demonstrate the inputs and the outcomes of really good prevention work. So for example, over the past 2 years, so much has gone virtual in response to COVID, and there was a lot of need to level up the quality of inside the classroom curricular design. But what does that look like for the outside the classroom experience of students? So my team has taken research-based criteria, operationalized them into technology metrics to really set standards of practice for the quality of digital prevention programs. We call that our seal of prevention. This is their second year of the seal. We had about 500 colleges and universities achieve that standard. And what's really great is when you start to look at the outcomes of those institutions, they've got a 10% higher retention rate compared to institutions that haven't achieved that standard. So this has real meaning and value to both the mission and the business of higher education. So for me, as a public health professional, taking on such pervasive issues with this sort of rigor and at this scale really represents the kind of population level social impact that has huge ripple effects on institutions and their communities. So all the things that we're talking about today.
Thank you, Rob. And Terry, you've served in your role at Hamilton College since 2017. Can you help us set the scene about your work and how student success is defined at a private liberal arts college like Hamilton?
Yes, and Michael, we are, 100% residential, so all of our students live on campus. And I think as many schools define success by taking a look at retention and graduation rates, we're at an institution where retention and graduates are in the mid-90s. And so we have to think about retention and we need to think about success in a different way. So for us, we think about whether or not students are connecting with their academic advisors, academic departments. Are they engaging in experiential learning opportunities such as research, study abroad? Are they engaged in service in the community? Are they utilizing the resources that we have available for them? The counseling center, our academic support centers for writing, and are they engaging in their life outside of the classroom, right? Are they participating in student organizations? Are they engaged in religious practice? Are they thinking about, how their organizations can impact the community? Are they involved in athletics, right? So if a student is engaged in those things, then we know that they're having a successful experience. And so what we need to do is measure the impact of those various, aspects of the student experience to make sure that they're connected and building relationships. And so we're really thinking about how students access those to make sure that it's an equitable practice for us, right? So that every student knows about the connections with the Career Center or with study abroad, and that happens along the way. So we've just created a new advising model so that students can think about their team of coaches, if you will. And so we have a new advisors called Alex, which is in the process of developing a curriculum and delivering that curriculum alongside all of the other things that are happening on campus. So it's a go-to person for them, much like their academic advisor or their coach or someone in residential life, right? So they get to create a network of support.
Well, I think one kind of framing question that I'd love to think about as we talk through some more specific topic areas is just the short, the medium, and the long-term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously there have been profound impacts, and they're very different at a residential campus, Terry, like yours, compared to others. What are some specific ways that the pandemic has changed things on your campuses, or Rob, with the schools that you work with? And let's start by looking at maybe mental health and wellness. I know even before the pandemic, demand for mental health services on many campuses was rising. What have you seen? Does anyone want to start us there?
Yeah,
I don't mind. Go ahead, Terry.
To say, when we were in a position where our students were away, right, we know how profoundly difficult it was for students to stay connected and to stay well. So we were able to continue serving them through our counseling center with teletherapy, but then we were also able to bring on additional support for therapists we're in an upstate rural area, so not a great deal of diversity with respect to our staffing opportunities. opportunities. So we were able to augment our on-campus staffing with others from across the country who could help us do that. And we also, created care contacts for ourselves, and that would allow us to connect students with other adults on campus when they needed support, and not necessarily in a therapeutic way. We focused on healthy habits, eating habits, sleeping habits, and delivered those in a number of programmatic opportunities.
I'm so glad Terry shared that. I think the emphasis of telehealth, telecoaching, teletherapy has been emphasized, but I know a lot of the national organizations such as American College Health Association, ACUD, NASFA, others all wrote supportive statements for allowing practitioners and clinicians to practice across state lines, which was an issue before. And COVID allowed, at least for some temporary assistance for clinicians to be able to do that. But we need a longer term plan, because a lot of times our students, when they go home for break, have built some relationships with their support persons on campus, and they can't see them based off legalities. And so I think a longer term plan needs to happen for those to be able to continue to have some continuity of care. But I think the biggest thing COVID has emphasized and still has is that it's a mental health concern. But the public health person in me has emphasized that we still haven't gotten to the root cause of a lot of the concerns. I've done a root cause analysis of, is it really mental health? Because some of this is based off basic needs. Some of it is built off structural and systemic racism for our students of color, our indigenous, our international students who've experienced it because of COVID. It's been exacerbated. But specifically for those here who've been US born and raised, who've experienced systemic and structural racism, it only got worse for them. And so we know disproportionately COVID made a lot of our students who were low on the socioeconomic spectrum, Pell Grant eligible, and our students of color, it exacerbated already some really dire situations. And so you need to kind of start there, because the mental health wasn't necessarily, the data showed that the mental health became a problem, but that may not be the causation of the problem. And so when the data showed that we had an influx of depression and anxiety, what we didn't figure out was that the actual cause of why we had an increase in depression and anxiety. And so we've been throwing money and trying to hire ourselves out of this mental health crisis in higher ed by hiring more therapists, but we forgot to hire more staff in prevention. We forgot to hire more staff in the disability services. We forgot to hire more staff in the basic needs and the support offices, such as student advocacy. And I want to emphasize that many of our prevention offices, I'm going to pick on health promotion, health education areas, who've been doing this work pre-COVID, have been peer education led by volunteers and unpaid students for decades. And we got all of these students doing this great work for no money, but we pay other students across campus to sit at the front desk, to work in other areas across campus, to be paid. We have to think about the equity of that type of work when we ask students to do training around bystander intervention, alcohol education, serious issues that are mandated programs, but we ask our students to volunteer to do it. So we haven't prioritized what should be a priority for our campuses. And so mental health is not just about counseling. It has to be that continuum of care of prevention. And we need to do a better job of understanding what the issues are for our students prior to coming. For some, it is true mental health. And we need to be able to communicate to our parents and families what we can and what we cannot do based off, sometimes we just are, as Terry talked about, we may not have the appropriate services on our campuses or in the community. I just came from a campus that didn't have a psychiatrist in the county, not because the hospital, not because our campus didn't try, we just didn't have one. And so there are certain limitations, but campuses have to communicate that out to families so they understand the limitations. And so I want to emphasize that. And so the national organizations have tried. I know our KC, the Wellness and Health Promotion KC for NASFA, we did a health equity series. ACHA had a racial marginalization national conference. They also had a task force to focus on health inequities. So all of these organizations have done some work. There's so much more to do, but I want to emphasize that mental health is not just about mental health therapy and counseling. It is so much more than that.
It really is.
Dr. Albert,
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just
Please go
gonna
ahead,
say,
Terry.
it's really about looking at the entire system, right? And points of contact for students and how we can support them along that entire continuum. Right?
And I want to just double click on a couple of things that you had said, Dr. Albert. If we pan up a level, there were a lot of challenges that higher ed had been facing prior to the pandemic that the pandemic didn't cause, but it accelerated, it exacerbated. So a decade of declining enrollment, questions of value and relevance, rising costs, changing demographics, increased competition and disruption. So all of those things are happening. And what we're learning about sort of at the macro level, working with 2,200 colleges and universities, first with students, particularly those in Gen Z, they are socially conscious. They are activism oriented. They are issue inclined. I mean, just reading the Chronicle of higher ed over the past 2 weeks, there were numerous articles about student activism and protests around sexual assault, around racism. But when we also then looked at our data on today's young people and the drivers of satisfaction with the college experience, whether or not a campus met students' expectations around well-being was more strongly correlated with their satisfaction than any other factor, including cost, rigor, and academic opportunity. So then when we think about the implications of that and how we're showing up to meet those student expectations, we know here that well-being and prevention work is more than just superficial programmatic efforts. It involves creating the conditions and building the skills that allow our community to thrive. But as you were saying, Dr. Albert, and I think you were reinforcing, Terry, is that we're often resourcing this work too minimally. It ends up being too reactive and downstream and too tactical and siloed to really be, as you had said earlier, Dr. Rennick, transformational. So a couple examples. I was talking a few months ago to a vice president for student affairs at an institution in Mid-Atlantic. And he was saying that they had just achieved a top ranking for their well-being efforts. He's like, Rob, it's because we spent $1 million the year before on hiring new counselors, and that's doing nothing to get ahead of the mental health challenges our students are facing. It's only creating a faster revolving door at our counseling center. And our own data shows that when students are struggling with mental health challenges, the first person they're likely to talk to is going to be a friend or a roommate and not a counselor. And so that requires us to take a much more universal approach to building the skills of empathy and compassion and active listening. But we're not resourced to do that kind of work well. We've found that the average dollar per student budget for campuses on a topic like sexual assault prevention is basically equivalent to a Chicken McNugget Happy Meal. But at leading institutions doing this work, they're spending 3 times that amount. They have twice as many staff. Their presidents are speaking about these issues publicly 3 to 4 times more often. They're using technology in intentional and effective ways. So we really have to start thinking differently about well-being and prevention, that it is a process and not a program, that it is an investment and not an expense. It's a presidential imperative, not just a student affairs issue, because the results of doing that work well touch everything we care about as institutions of higher ed, not just our mission, but our business. So if we're thinking about this work as just checking the box and just reactively responding to students' needs or cutting our student affairs budgets down to the bone, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of meeting student expectations and improving the institutional outcomes that matter most at such an important time for our industry.
And Rob just mentioned the challenge of identifying these issues at scale. Let me say that one of the lessons we learned at Georgia State over the pandemic is how important, given our size, which is 54,000 students, it was to have some of these data-based and technology platforms in place. So one thing we were doing throughout the pandemic from the day we went live with entirely online classes a year ago spring was tracking logons to classes, right? Is a student logging on? Seems really small and incidental, but we did it over 30,000 times during the school year where we found students weren't logging on and we had an academic professional reach out to them and say, what's going on? In some cases, they were academic problems, but what we found in a number of instances is the reason a student wasn't logging on to the class they paid for 3 days into the semester was because they were facing other issues, other crises, and we were able to get those students connected to help much more quickly. As a result, we had far more meetings one-on-one between our counselors and our students this year than we ever did in face-to-face. The other example, I already mentioned the chatbot. You know, this seemingly high-tech tool is another way for us to connect with students. One, we can send prompts and questions and advice to students and ask for their reaction. But we also set up the chatbot so that there are trigger words. If a student mentions harming themselves or suicide and so forth, that particular text doesn't go into the knowledge base for the AI to answer. It goes directly to a professional in the Dean of Students office to reach out to that student for help. So when we're dealing, unlike Hamilton, with a kind of almost overwhelmingly large challenge of a student body that's 80% non-white and or Pell and oftentimes in great need, we've been trying to leverage these other resources to connect the students to help as quickly as possible.
A real quick reflection on the first point that you had made. What it brings to mind for me is sort of a leveling up of the student affairs outcomes. Like, there's the work that we're doing, but thinking strategically about how that's plugging into other value streams on campus. And the example that came to mind for me is thousands of institutions are using online programs, pre-matriculation, on topics like alcohol or sexual assault, because we know that arrival on campus is a high-risk period for students. So over the summer, before students arrive, they're deploying these online programs. And some institutions have started to look at the participation rates in these programs as a predictor of melt. Like, if a student's not going through a program that we're mandating and putting holds on registration for, they're probably not going to show up in the fall. And so that is an early warning sign indicator that we should be more actively engaging with that student, or at least refining our models to know what our fall enrollment is going to look like.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. When we started tracking all the logons to the LMS and the online platforms, we were primarily thinking of it as an academic intervention. We can't let the students get behind. But what it turned into was a mental health intervention, a financial wellness intervention. We had thousands of students say the reason why they're not logging onto their class is they can't cover their rent, or they're having food insecurity or other problems. So what these early warning signs can really do is be an entry point to discovering much larger issues that the student may be facing.
And that's exactly what I was going to say, Tim. We got to keep the humanistic part in our approaches, because if we don't keep that part in it, we can easily make the assumptions that these potentially first generation students are not invested, not engaged, when it could be, as a first gen student, I'm working 2 jobs just to prepare to get ready to go to college. And I'm going to take it at the last minute when I actually have time, probably when I have no choice but to take it when I'm driving up to campus to move in, which is actually what I did when I was moving into campus. And so making those decisions when they have to make those decisions. So I want to emphasize that, because a lot of times our go-to response is they're not invested, they're not engaged, they're not going to, participate and make this a priority, when in reality they're having to prioritize when they can invest in their schooling, as we would say, based off, I got to feed myself or my family and help out with all these other things prior to when I leave for college. And when I go to college, when I get my financial aid refund check, some of that money has to still go home and help the support. And as an institution of higher ed, if that has not been your lived experience, it is so easy to misconstrue a student's response in the classroom, or lack of response in the classroom, as disengagement.
I wanted to go back to something that Tim said as well. You talked about someone else reaching out to the student because they haven't logged on, to find out why they weren't logged on, to make those points of connection. And what that really does is broaden, right? It removes silos, and it broadens responsibility for students, because ultimately they want to talk with someone, right, that can help them achieve whatever it is they need to achieve. So when we think about others who can reach out to students, not just the counselors or not just folks in student affairs, that we think about where they work on campus, right? How do we train campus supervisors to identify when a student may be going through an issue because they're not showing up for work or they come in looking tired, right? And how do we make sure that faculty members can also take a look at, the signs from a student and how they can step in an intervention, right? An intervention that will allow them to connect with other resources on campus. So I think it's helpful when we're thinking about siloed work.
I definitely want to probe more into that and this idea of the kind of interdisciplinary and cross silo or breaking down silo approach. But one good question from someone in our audience that I'd love to ask and hear you all respond to briefly. What about staff and employees at a university? You know, the student experience we've talked about, but you know, as staff are overloaded in certain cases, and you know, the pandemic has taken its toll on them and on many of you. You know, an audience member from a large public university asks, you know, can you talk about how you're getting buy-in from student affairs professionals or leadership to focus on employee well-being, and if there are any strategies or programs that are really working in that regard?
One simple thing we're doing, excuse me, is just training our academic advisors. Every 6 months, they get training from our financial aid office to recognize and ask some pointed questions about financial issues. They get training from staff at our counseling center they're obviously not counselors as such, but they can be trained to recognize the warning signs and what to do and how to speak to a student who may be going through those issues. And you know what we end up doing, because our advising office is one of the most traffic laden places on campus. It has about 70,000 in-person visits every year, is leveraging the fact that the students already are compelled to go to that office for various reasons to connect them with others.
Shante,
so a couple of things. Oh yes. So my background is in employee health, and so thanks to the restructure here of our senior vice president, Dr. Melissa Shivers, I'll have an employee wellness coordinator that'll be higher up under me to help take the lead. And so our chief wellness officer has built a program for employees here at Ohio State. You can participate as much as you choose, biometric scans and all those things. And so we get their data. And so I better get the data for student life here and across the 5 regional campuses. And we'll take that as part of our needs assessment. But we'll also build a true needs assessment for our employees here in student life. And we'll engage our employees based off the needs assessment data. So that'll be one part. But I think the biggest thing is Rob kind of hinted to it, is that student affairs has been built as a very face-to-face, hands-on field. And it has functioned that way for decades. And we haven't given ourselves permission to look at it as anything other but it's time for us to reconfigure that, because we're seeing many of our young professionals of color say, you know what, I don't want this, especially because of the hours and the lower pay. And so we're going to have to think outside the box as a field, especially as it's not even burnout anymore. It's pure exhaustion that some of the staff has experienced, because a lot of them have never left campus. While some have been able to work from home, a lot of our staff have never left. And so we want to make sure that we find a way to engage in ways from them to recenter and to find ways to engage in health and well-being. And so how we can do that is to, how do you build it into your professional development as a priority? So that's what we're working on now here. And you can also build it into the professional development plan, but also make it part of the expectations for supervisors. How are you engaging in wellness checks with your staff? And I know a lot of people say, well, people come to work just to come to work and leave. But again, they come to work to work, but they don't check all those emotions at the door. You still have to make sure that they're well and being able to engage in the work that they do, especially if they have students working in their office who is mimicking what they see from the people that are supervising them. And so I think you just have to take a very multidimensional approach. I'm a fan of the dimensions of wellness. They're easy to use in how you engage, because the dimensions are verbs. They are actions that you can put into action. And it's not about being perfect in any of those dimensions. And so that's an easy way to start to engage in conversation about how each employee, each staff, each student is engaging in those dimensions.
So there's this whole person aspect that you're talking about, Dr. Albert, and certainly there's that dual role that our employees play of being burdened with their own challenges and their own lives and the difficulties at this point in time, but also playing this role of being a first point of contact for students. And so I think that's globally true at all institutions. But one light that I just want to shine on, those coming from community colleges, I think there's some real particular implications of that approach there. Whereas I was talking to a community college leader several years ago now, and he's saying, look, Robert, at four-year institutions that are residential in nature, you can change the culture by changing the students. You've got lots of opportunities to influence them and engage them to be change agents in the community. But at a two-year non-residential institution where you have a very transient relationship with your students, you change the culture by changing your staff and faculty. And you want every single interaction that your students have with an employee at your community college to be really focused on fostering the sort of life-changing growth that community college experience can have for a student. So I think all the things that you're saying are even more particularly true at our community colleges.
I think, moving on to a somewhat different topic, but I'm curious about your take on, the faculty, and I want to talk about diversity and inclusion. I think each of you have kind of hinted at this a bit in some of your comments already, but are there some specific ways that on campus, on your campuses or with schools you work with, that you're, improving diversity, fostering more inclusivity on campus? Some have proposed, the idea that you need to recruit more faculty and staff color and from diverse backgrounds is a really important, not first step, but crucial foundation for this. Can you talk about how this kind of is so integral to student success and creating that foundation for students on campus, no matter what their background is?
So that was actually one of the health equity workshops, the wellness and health promotion KC offered. Myself, Ashley Hinton, the co-chair for the KC, and Dr. Alicia Battle co-presented on was recruiting and retaining professionals of color in college health and wellness. We have to. One is the recruiting trait into the field, because there's 5 different sectors for the field of public health. And students need to know that this is an actual field that they can choose to go into. I didn't know that this was possible, and until I had a mentor who was a health educator tell me that this was a possible field. We need multilingual, we need multi-ethnic, multiracial staff, but we also need different staff with different lived experiences, so that when students present in our places and spaces, that someone is there to embrace their experiences. And then, because many of our clinical spaces staff cases, that even if that clinician or that provider doesn't understand it, that somebody that's staff in that case can give them some insight, and you have ongoing training. And I know Terry mentioned it's hard to recruit to certain spaces, and I've been there. My previous campus was on the West Coast in the middle of nowhere. And so being able to have recruitment plans and being able to be honest in those recruitment plans on some of the challenges, and then when possible, working with some of the third-party vendors, that saying we have an emphasis in having multilingual, multiracial, and ethnic providers is a necessity. But I think the biggest thing is starting with your campuses. If you have health sciences on your campuses, working with the faculty there and creating internships and co-curricular experiences for those students. And if there's no faculty there, many of us in the field mentor. I still go back and mentor to my own undergraduate program because most of the faculty of color have retired. And so if you don't have it, LinkedIn is a very valuable resource if you choose to use it to find many faculty and staff of different backgrounds. And so I think as an administrator, it's my job to be actively engaged in the searches in my unit. And sometimes you have to stop a search if they're not being, if they're not putting the work to actually recruit and not just posting a job on the HR website. You actually have to have a recruitment plan, email people, reaching out to people, and not being so formal in the process where you're rigid on the requirements. Because a lot of times mentorship and some of these requirements completely move people who may be from some of those minoritized, marginalized backgrounds out of the search from the very beginning. And so we need to look at our recruitment practices and make sure that we're not automatically removing certain populations from the process from the very beginning. And so we just need to have some intentionality a lot better in our processes. And I'm going to look at those who are supervisors to hold their staff accountable for having true recruitment and retention plans. And the retention plans includes when something is happening that's impacting those staff members from those backgrounds to do something, because that's word of mouth spreads. And that is the culture that is impacting why people don't want to come and work at your institutions. So hurt people, and they also spread the word until people don't come and work at your institutions. And so that's just going to be an important part of the process to make sure we're all doing the work.
Yeah, Shantae, it reminds me of two things, right? But it's not just recruitment, it's thinking about how you get folks in that pipeline, right? And thinking about how a search committee thinks about their unconscious bias, right? So making sure that it speaks to the very rigid requirements that may be in place. How do we open up, right? How do we expand the reach, but also welcome from different backgrounds? And then conversely, when they get onto campus, how is a campus looking at retaining and including and making individuals, students, faculty, and staff feel as they belong, right? What are the opportunities for mentorship? What are the opportunities for growth? How can you connect people with like experiences so that we build community, whether it's on campus or in partnership with organizations and individuals in the community? So it's not just taking a look at, as you said, where you post. There's a lot of work that needs to go in before, and certainly a lot of work that needs to happen afterwards.
On that pipeline issue, I'll mention that Georgia State is one of the largest MSIs in the country. We now produce more Black students with bachelor's degree than any other college or university. We use predictive analytics, as I've described, to flag students who may be going off path, but we also very intentionally use predictive analytics to flag students who might be good candidates for national scholarships, for graduate school, for professional school, and so forth. Because for our students, mostly first generation low income, you really need to begin working with them in the first year or so of college to make them fully competitive, to help them get to be fully competitive for some of these opportunities. So that's part of our responsibility as well, as far as pipeline is concerned, is make sure that we're graduating students in large numbers from our undergraduate programs and then getting them into the professional schools where they will populate the applicant pools for some of these faculty positions.
You know, I can't think of a more urgent leadership priority and imperative than diversity, inclusion, and belonging. At this point in time where we're at with our country and the polarization of our institutions, there is a great need for presidential tone from the top on these issues. And we just a few months ago convened what we called our Presidential Stewardship Forum. So I think stewardship is the new leadership of higher education. And we brought together college chancellors and presidents, and they very quickly identified the challenges around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, social justice. And what they said is, we are getting pulled in two very different directions on these issues. We are hearing our students say that we cannot do enough to talk about anti-racism and inclusion and belonging on campus. We have to be investing more to meet our students' expectations. But then our board and the legislators in our states are telling us that we're talking too much around these issues. We are veering away from the academic mission and priorities of our institution. And so I think it's a real crisis that our leaders are facing. And they were pretty clear to say that as soon as we stick our head out of the foxhole on this issue, like, we're getting shot at. And it's really difficult for us to find out how to navigate these competing pressures around how we should show up and lead here. And so I think, the responsibilities at, the student affairs leader level on campus is absolutely leading up and providing the sort of language that our presidents and chancellors can use to model the inclusive excellence vision that we want to have for our institutions. And also, thinking about how we can use this framing of well-being as a way to disarm and depoliticize these really combative issues right now in our society, to say, look, this is about creating conditions where our community can thrive. And in the process of creating those conditions, our institution can also thrive. But I think we can't overstate how important this is for our university leaders to show up big and to model that tone from the top on these important issues.
Moving on to Terry, I have a question for you. I think your role at Hamilton, like at a lot of liberal arts colleges, encompasses so many of these areas: residential programs, fraternity, sorority life, career services, and so on. How does that work? How are you able to kind of break down some of those silos at a campus of your size? Coming back to that idea of this takes really taking a village of the whole campus community.
Sure. And much of our campus is around relationships, how we build relationships and then extend welcome and presume welcome, right? So we do many working groups that are cross-divisional. When we take a look at an issue and we look at it from different angles so that folks are working together to solve whatever or to address the matter, right, that they're focusing on. We have a very unique opportunity at Hamilton because on my staff, I have a faculty member who serves as academic outreach, right? So right there, that connects the student experience to the academic experience. But that person can then refer to other areas, whether they're in student affairs or academic affairs, to make sure that they get the support that they're needed, right? So it's about thinking about a particular issue from a 360-degree perspective and making sure that those voices are involved in addressing the issue.
And Tim, thinking about Georgia State and the kind of student success infrastructure that you all have there, could you talk a little bit more about that? I know you've talked about the ways that you all use analytics, but again, thinking beyond just using that information from an academic performance standpoint, how can you tell us a bit about the sort of holistic way you all think about that?
Sure, Michael. And I will say in advance that I think this does have a direct impact upon some of the larger themes we've just been discussing, like student mindset and wellness. So one example is about 10 years ago, we saw a big problem with our students who were reaching senior status academically, but stopping out and dropping out. And what we found is that most of our students, about 80%, are working, and yet most of our scholarship programs, including the biggest state scholarship in the state of Georgia, the Hope Scholarship, only cover 4 years. So we had good academically qualified students who were running out of eligibility right before they dropped out, or excuse me, right before they graduated, and they were dropping out and not coming back again. So we started a data-based microgrant program. Students don't have to apply for it. We identify students who are at risk of getting dropped for financial reasons or have financial holds on their accounts and so forth. And we look at their academics to make sure that they're taking the right classes. They don't have to be great scholars, but are they making progress to their degree? And we just started putting the money in the student's account up to $2,000, just say you're good to go. We took what was a 30% completion rate for students who were stopping out for financial reasons in their senior year, and we've turned that into an over 80% completion rate. But the connection to mindset is that when we talked to these students and began looking at our exit surveys of our graduating seniors, we began to hear these students say things like, I never knew that somebody was watching out for me. I never knew that somebody cared. The mere fact that they were getting the money without an application not only made the grant accessible to a greater number of students, but it also had a positive impact on their mindset and their belief and their own need to succeed and desire to complete their degree programs. I'll say with the pandemic, we used exactly those analytics to distribute our federal CARES Act and other sorts of money. We did set up an application process, and over the last 18 months, we've had about almost 7,000 grants that we've given because students have applied for them. We've given over 70,000, so 10 times more grants, just based upon the fact that we know these students are hurting. We can see in the data that they don't have enough money, they have high unmet need, they have unpaid balances and so forth. So why are we waiting for the students to come to us and beg for the money? Why don't we just find an efficient way to get it into their hands.
Rob, I have a question for you, and then I'll broaden it to the group. Somebody from our audience wonders about the Campus Prevention Network and just would love to learn some other kind of insights you've gathered from the wide range of schools you work with, projecting forward too, thinking about beyond this academic year. Are there some other examples that come to mind that you haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, I mean, we are all about leveraging this network to really achieve that sort of network effect. As every new college or university joins the network, as every new learner goes through our programs, we're getting more data, more insights that add more value to the rest of the network, and really sort of intending to connect people who are often feeling isolated at their individual role in their individual institution and connecting them to a community of practice that's really strategic focused, that is really data driven, that is really outcomes based. And I would say that, across the board, what I'm starting to see is this sort of articulation of a student success 2.0, where at the center of that is a revolution around well-being. And what we're learning from our data and our research and what's starting to really come to life in our network is that well-being is fundamental to every aspect of the student life cycle. So starting with recruitment and enrollment, our future students are socially conscious consumers. They are making consumer decisions based on their values. And we surveyed about 5,000 graduating high school seniors who intended to go to college. 82% of them said that safety, well-being, and inclusion were as important as academic rigor when deciding where they wanted to go to college. But close to half of those students said it was difficult for them to find how campuses were addressing these issues. And that was one of the reasons we created our Seal of Prevention, is to elevate the visibility of those institutions that are making significant investments in the safety, well-being, and inclusion of their community, because we're not telling that story effectively to students who are making their decision about where they go to college based on the stories that we're telling them. And what we heard from students is, of those high school students, over a third of them said they'd be more likely to go to a campus that has that seal of prevention. So that's, how we're working with our partners in sort of admissions and enrollment. But then when students arrive, we talked about their engagement, we talked about their satisfaction, the quality of an institution's prevention strategy, and not just their programs, their funding, their staffing, their presidential visibility, their goal setting and strategic planning and policy, like that process of prevention. The quality of that process is statistically predictive of first-year retention rates and four-year graduation rates. So again, when we're talking about the issues that leaders at our institutions are staying up at night concerned about, we are plugging into every single one of those facets, even career readiness. The primary reason students continue to come to college is to get a good job. But simultaneously now, we've got people coming to college because they're really looking to take on big challenges, social justice, climate change, and the experience of college with a focus on well-being and relationships, as Terry was talking about, is what makes higher ed durable in the face of new disruptive options to get career-ready skills outside of the academy, like Google Career Certificates. For example, the programs and experiences that we're delivering outside the classroom are also helping to build the human skills that employers are looking for in the 21st century workforce. So I would just say that right now, we have got to reimagine the value and purpose of higher education and double down on the mission and vision of our institutions, because we have the ability to not only shape how our students think, but also to shape the quality of their character and really change the trajectory of their lives, who they can be, what they can do, and the kind of impact that they can have in their careers and their communities. And so centering our focus on well-being isn't just about changing the future of higher education, it's about changing the future of the world.
I think I'd love to stay with that idea, Rob, and think about the consumers, parents and families and prospective students. If we could kind of spend a moment talking about that group, and whether any of you have advice about how, what a prospective student should look for and ask about when it comes to this broad definition of student success. Is it mental health services? Is it kind of all of the above? So many of the areas that you all have talked about. Do you have any specific advice or insights or even resources that you could point that group of individuals to? Shantae, I'll pick on you. Do anything come to mind from your perspective?
It really depends on the families, the support person's resources. If they have insurance and it's not a high deductible plan, then it may not really matter what the campus has, because they can use community resources if there is a viable health plan there. So if they have doctor's offices, ambulatory care facilities, optometry, dental, then they can use their parents or their insurance. But if that is an issue and they have a high deductible plan, then maybe going to a campus that has those extraordinary services where they have a student health fee and other fees there, where we don't contract with those insurance companies and use their panel to raise our costs, then it may be much more affordable to go to a campus that has the those type of services on campuses, and they have a counseling center, a recreational space, and student wellness that does health education and promotion. It just depends on the need and what type of resources that family has. And so it really, I'm going to start there. If they mandate vaccinations and they mandate you have health insurance, and that's going to kind of guide. But if they mandate, in health insurance, that means financial aid can help cover some of the costs. So it really is going to depend on the needs. But what I will say is, as a first-gen student, now you can have insurance through your parents to 26. That was an option when I was an undergrad. So all those options depends. But if there's some pre-existing health concerns, then you need to come to the orientations, to the campus tours, and have a chance to talk to those healthcare practitioners and ask those questions, because some campuses are only ran by RN or maybe a nurse practitioner and may not have the type of services if there are some serious health concerns there. And you may need to make sure that the surrounding community can support those mental health and wellness concerns. So those are things that you would need to be mindful of depending on the campus and the type of campus you go to. As long as that community can support your needs, then it may not matter which campus you go to, but it may. And so I always say it's almost like that checklist of your needs and your wants. And so like, even for me, it wasn't just where I can go, but I also needed my personal needs. Can I get my hair done? Do they have products for me? Or do I have to always order my stuff on Amazon? Do I have to drive 3 hours away to go get my hair done because there's no stylist for my ethnic hair, as where, so all those things is not just about, health and wellness, but it's about my person. Can my person be able to go to a place that's safe at the same time? Can I go to the Walmart and not be followed around and have to go talk to the person at the front and say, look, I'm being followed around and I'm not stealing, but because of my skin color? All those safety concerns are things that you need to ask about. And so for me, as a consumer, I'm going to ask all of those questions during a campus tour, ask those questions to the healthcare facilities, visit the local area, urgent cares, those type of things. And, and then most importantly, call your health insurance and ask, will they let you use those facilities at that campus? If it's not in your network, what their deductible, what that will look like if you go to somewhere outside of your network. So those are my basic things that I would ask.
I think Shantae's advice is excellent for those who don't have the ability to ask those questions or to even visit the campus. I'll say one thing to look at is the success rates for students in your demographic group. That's easily accessible. Any Google search, if you look at the institution and ask for graduation rates by different demographics, will give you that view. One definition of wellness long-term is certainly not to have a large debt load and no meaningful credential. And that clearly we've seen again and again is one of the biggest burdens we can place on not only individuals, but their entire family. So make sure that the campus you're going to has a success record for supporting the type of individual you are.
Rob and Terry, do you have any parting words? And maybe one as a final question, I want to give everyone the chance to talk about this in the minute or so we have left. how are there any other ways that college and university leaders can think about investing in programs and helping ensure that they're sustainable over the long term? You know, not a one-off in investment or something that is kind of you know, has no teeth to it. Anything else come to mind from the two of you?
We are institutions of higher learning. We are really good at building curricula. So why don't we curricularize the student experience and curricularize this notion of a multifaceted definition of well-being? We have that opportunity to do it. That can be deeply rigorous, that can be very data-driven, that can be integrated throughout every step of the student experience inside and outside the classroom. And I guarantee you when we do that, we will be producing graduates at higher rates that are more successful in their careers and contributing to, as conscientious global citizens, to our society. So I'd say let's do what we do best and let's curricularize well-being.
Right. And I just to piggyback on that, Rob, it's to think about where you're having the biggest impact and how to make that sustainable. It's by using data, right? How are we using particular services, or how are we changing a system? And how do we know that it's working, right? You need to use the data to make those decisions.
That's a great note to end on, and a great call to action for those of you who are listening, and you know, for you to bring back to your own campuses or organizations. I want to thank the group we have here. This was a tremendous discussion. Thanks for covering so much ground, being with us today. Thank you to those in our audience and for all the good questions. And we look forward to having you join us again for a future session. Thank you all.
Thank you.